For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled or commanded significant influence in the Arab world. Many Arabs reasonably weren't happy with this, and as Ottoman power declined more and more in the 1800s, Arab nationalism, or the idea that Arabs belonged to a single Arab nation, saw increased membership and prominence. Despite the growth of this movement, many people in the region were still not too bothered with the Ottomans. That changed in World War I when King Hussein bin Ali launched the Arab Revolt. He was supported by the British, who promised him a unified Arab state. But the British were the British, so when the war ended, they carved up the territory with the French through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, betraying Arab nationalists who used this to gain more members and spread their ideas. As time went on, the movement became more anti-imperialist, socialist, and wanted the West out of the Middle East. The defeat of the Arab countries in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War saw further growth of Arab nationalism. All this movement now needed was a leader, and they got that with Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser led a coup which overthrew the Egyptian monarchy in 1952. After a brief power struggle, he became the head of the Revolutionary Command Council in 1954 and President of Egypt in 1956. Nasser's support for Arab nationalism, as well as his support for the Palestinian movement and the Algerian independence struggle, made him popular amongst the followers of Pan-Arabism. Other policies like the nationalization of the Suez Canal, socialist economic policies, and secularism, as well as victory in the Suez Crisis, only increased his appeal. It also helped that he was the president of Egypt, a regional power as well as a cultural center for the Arab world at the time. Now that the movement had a leader, they just needed a country that would be willing to merge with Egypt. In 1958, Syria came calling. In Syria, there was a fear that the Communist Party was becoming stronger and might soon take over. The Ba'ath Party believed that the only way to prevent this was a political union with Egypt. Nasser was initially reluctant, but not wanting the Communists to take over, he agreed. He set 3 conditions for a merger: a plebiscite, dissolution of all the parties for a one-party system, and removal of the army from politics. The people voted in favor of the merger, and in 1958, Egypt and Syria merged together, forming the United Arab Republic.
Woo! Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for. That's what it's all about. Woo!
Later, the UAR and North Yemen would merge, forming a new country called the United Arab States. But this was more of a loose confederation, with North Yemen being practically independent. The formation of the UAR prompted Iraq and Jordan to merge their countries, forming the Arab Federation to counter Nasser. However, the union didn't last long, as the military conducted a coup in Iraq in 1958. Many members of the coup were supporters of Nasser and wanted Iraq to join the UAR. And if this had happened, this is what the UAR would look like. But Abdul Karim Qasim didn't want to give up his power, thus talks for a union ended in 1959. There was even support in Lebanon for a union, but that led to nowhere. Despite the support for Pan-Arabism, however, the union between Egypt and Syria only lasted till 1961. The reason for this was the Syrian establishment felt that Nasser was placing Egyptians above them. The new National Assembly gave Egypt 400 seats to 200 seats for Syria. Syrian military officers were in lower positions compared to Egyptians. The Syrian economy was also struggling, and many in the business community didn't like Nasser's economic policies, which included nationalizations. The Ba'ath Party, which supported Nasser, didn't like the one-party system and the fact that they weren't given prominent positions in the government. All this resentment led to a successful coup led by Syrian military officers in 1961, which resulted in Syria declaring independence. Soon the confederation with North Yemen was dissolved as well. While this does seem like the end of the UAR, it came pretty close to being revived in 1965. This is because while the first attempt at a pan-Arab nation failed, Pan-Arabism was still very popular, and there was plenty of support for Nasser in Syria and in the wider Arab world. In 1963, a Ba'athist-Nasserist alliance toppled the Qasim government in Iraq, and a similar alliance removed the government in Syria. Both sides sent delegations to Egypt for a new union, and unlike the previous merger, this one would be a federal union, giving each country some power and autonomy, while Nasser would become the president and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. An agreement was signed on the 17th of April, but it didn't go through. In Syria, a purge of 50 pro-Nasser military officers from high-ranking positions virtually ended the agreement, and the new union ended before it even began. After 1965, Pan-Arabism began to decline. The reasons for this were the rise of Pan-Islamism, the economic slowdown in Egypt and Syria in the 1960s, the 1967 Six-Day War which Israel won comfortably, making Pan-Arabism less appealing, and the death of Nasser in 1970. Still, there was a time when, if things had gone differently, a huge portion of the Middle East could have united under one banner.